I think he really was the greatest friend I ever had. And very often, Tony sort of treated me like a father almost, you know. I mean, I'm not that old, but he used to lean on me quite a bit, which suited me because I felt that I put him at ease a lot. And, well, he used to worry about his performance, and he'd come and say, how do you think that was? And I'd say, marvelous, you can't do any better. But then I'd make little odd suggestions that perhaps it would be better if the camera went back to him for his reactions, which really was Tony's prime thing. He came to rehearsal one morning and he said, you just won't believe it. You will not believe it, but I have been asked to do face-to-face with John Freeman. So we all said, God, that's marvelous, isn't it? But you won't do it. And he said, no, I won't do it, but it's bloody marvelous. I mean, he's asked me, hasn't he? You know, he's done prime ministers, and he's fancy asking me. He couldn't get over it. He was in a daze with this, and he kept saying, in the middle of rehearsal, what happens if he asks me about religion? You know how I feel about religion. And I'd say, well, I wouldn't say that you're an atheist because you might lose a lot of customers. He says, well, no, it's unlucky. I mean, I am an atheist, and that's the way it is. That's the way it's got to be. I've got to tell him because, after all, it's face-to-face, isn't it? I've got to tell him the truth. I said, for God's sake, don't answer everything truthfully, Tony, because you'll be right in it. And he used to say, he'd mark down a list of questions that he'd like to be asked. And then, finally, when he did the interview, he said, he didn't ask me one bloody question of the ones I put down.
In the world outside, what would you most like to reform about the world if you had the chance?
I'm not capable of doing that.
Oh, don't you have dreams about it?
No. You just observe and practice within the limitations of your own talent what you see around you.
You've never dreamed of playing Hamlet?
No. I don't think it's for me, really.
You must have, and indeed I believe you have, in fact, got quite a lot of personal opinions all the same. Let's just take some of them. Have you got any religious views?
No, I have no religion now.
That means that you're not interested, or that
I'm deeply interested, and so we say I'm trying to find a faith, but I've had to throw away the initial faith that I was brought up in, and therefore am now starting again from scratch.
Well, now, what were you brought up in?
The Church of England.
I see. And you've thrown that away. Does that mean you don't believe in God any longer, or might you adopt some other Christian religion?
I'm completely, as I say, this has been eliminated now. This I no longer believe in. So therefore, I have to have an open mind and look for something else.
I think Tony was the best that I've ever known to work with. His timing, I've never known better timing. And, a lot of actors say this is a bad word to use, but I do not. I don't think it's a bad word to use. There isn't a better expression for it. I mean, it's like timing in golf. It's like timing in boxing. Whatever it is, your weight's in the right place when you're throwing the punch and when you're hitting the ball. And this is exactly the same. Tony had absolutely instinctive, perfect timing for radio, which is one thing, as you know, I don't have to tell you, and the other one on stage, and then the other medium, television. I think it was absolutely split-second perfect. I've never known anybody time like he did. We'd arrive at 10:30, spend an hour having coffee. We might have a game of snooker, because we rehearsed in this place, I've forgotten the name, that boys' club I've forgotten it. And we'd play either a bit of table tennis, which he was very good at. We'd play snooker, which he was very good at. And we'd rehearse for a couple of hours. Then we'd go to lunch, and those lunches would last about 2 hours. Then we'd go back and have another game of table tennis, and then do another couple of hours rehearsal. By this time, it would be about 6, and in this youth club, the boys were starting to gather. He'd say, well, can we go with that one again, Sid? And I'd say, Tony, now's the time I went home. And Duncan would look up to God and say, oh, for heaven's sake, when are we going to get rid of this fellow? Because he'd been playing snooker all day, table tennis. Anyway, we'd get the show together. And then Tony would start with the fit of nerves. And he'd say, I get the feeling we haven't rehearsed enough this week. God, he'd read Freud, he'd read the origin of languages. This really used to fascinate Tony to a tremendous extent. He'd drag me into Harrods, for instance, and he'd browse around the intellectual section for hours and hours and hours. What's the matter? Somebody else told you the same thing. And he'd drag me around this place for hours, and he'd pull down the biggest, thickest books you've ever seen in your life and say, I've got to have that one. That'd be about 24 quid or something. And he'd order that. And then he'd see something on acting written by some Russian name that not even Stanislavski's ever heard of, you know. But he had to read this guy. Then he'd grab a book on makeup, which he never ever used. In any case, he never had a thing on his face, ever. When he'd start trying to improve my mind. Well, it's all very well. I think my mind's improved enough. I'm happy enough with it as it is. And he used to get really mad at me. He says, for God's sake, learn a little. And I say, I know enough for what I need, Tony. I'm not going to be a professor. I don't want to. Is this going to improve my performance? He said, it might. You never can tell. I mean, you might make a gesture this way instead of that way. And I said, why don't you go tell Alec Guinness, leave me alone, you know. I think he wanted to go on his own because he felt that he was becoming a double act, which makes a lot of sense. There's no question about it. He did do the right thing. I would have liked to have gone on for one more series, but only one. And I was very upset, naturally, when he said, well, we've got to break it up now. We've got to make a clean cut. And I said, well, if that's the way it's got to be, that's the way it's got to be. He so desperately wanted to have that, the best thing he'd ever done in his life. But he was falling apart then. He was drinking too much. He was coming late on the set. He was trying to tell the director what to do and the producer what to do. And I mean, I wasn't on the movie, but, you know, in the business, you're told all these things. He told me himself. He said, I can't pull myself out of it. He said, I would have liked to have quit the film in the middle because I thought it was going to be a bad one. And I'd like to have quit it completely. But he said, I couldn't go that far. By that time, we'd gone too far, and I just had to finish it. And he said, when I finished the picture, he said, I just wanted to go away, dig ditches, go anywhere, go to France, be a beachcomber, anything, get away from it. He said, I couldn't stand seeing myself doing that again. I'll never forget, I was driving down Piccadilly one day, and I saw Tony standing on a traffic island, and he looked quite dreadful, quite dreadful. So I was down Piccadilly, and I tried to pull up and get over and see him. He really looked so miserable and so, oh God, I keep applying the word desperate to Tony because this is, I got the car parked and then I pulled up, but then he disappeared and I didn't see him again. That's the last time I saw him. He didn't see me. Wish to God I had been able to catch him that day. You know, all sorts of little things can change people's lives. But he was really full of liquor that day, and he was swaying around on this island, highly dangerous, you know. And odd cab drivers were pointing at him. Terrible, really. It's such a terrible, terrible shame.